You ruthless, heartless bastard!
Klingon bastard!
The Epic of Gilgamesh is considered to be the oldest known literary work. This Mesopotamian epic poem, of which I will not give an exhaustive summary here, depicts Gilgamesh, a proud and tyrannical king. To punish him, the gods create a rival for him in the person of Enkidu. During the fight, Gilgamesh and Enkidu realize they are evenly matched and stop fighting. Their friendship makes Gilgamesh not only a better person, but a better king. And together, they have several adventures until the gods kill Enkidu. This death saddens and traumatizes Gilgamesh, who embarks on a quest for immortality, a journey at the end of which he learns that death is inevitable and that life is therefore only more precious. At the start of Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, just as Gilgamesh has lost his best friend, Kirk has just lost his. But the lesson Gilgamesh will only learn after searching in vain for the secret of immortality, Kirk learned it at the end of the previous film, as he faced the inevitability of death like never before. As the Enterprise returns from this costly adventure, it seems that Kirk is losing another friend, because something is wrong with Dr. McCoy. He, who has shown himself so often at odds with the Vulcan during their many travels, is now haunted by the ghost of the latter, or more precisely, by his Katra, which Spock entrusted to him before sacrificing himself. Kirk realizes this after Sarek, Spock's father, informs him of this practice and blames him for abandoning Spock's body on Genesis. Although not explained very well in the film, upon the death of a Vulcan, the Katra is transferred into what they call a Katric ark, a recipient with which Vulcans can perform a mind meld to access the knowledge and wisdom of the deceased. And it would seem that the body is also important for the ritual because Sarek claims it.
McCoy.
One alive, one not. Yet both in pain.
What must I do?
You must bring them to Mount Silea on Vulcan. Only there can both find peace.
However, the words of the Vulcan are so ambiguous that it is possible to interpret them in another way. Maybe Spock's body only has symbolic value, or, no offense to Sarek, sentimental value. Maybe Kirk doesn't even need to fetch Spock's body for the Katra that afflicts McCoy can be transferred to a recipient. Trekkies are welcome to contradict me in the comments, but if we only trust the film itself, the dialogue is very imprecise, and if it's so imprecise, it's because Sarek's request is in the end not very important. In truth, Kirk is using it more as a pretext for another, more personal quest. He is looking for forgiveness, the most difficult forgiveness to obtain, his own.
I must have your thoughts. May I join your mind?
When at the end of the last film, the Enterprise was faced with a challenge reminiscent of the Kobayashi Maru test, Kirk still refused to believe he could fail, and it was his friend who paid the price.
Spock.
I have been, and always shall be, your friend. Live long and prosper. No.
And everything that he was, everything he knew, is lost.
Please wait. He would have found a way if there was that much at stake. Spock would have found a way.
Even if it constitutes the second part of a completely improvised trilogy, I consider that the search for Spock especially forms a diptych with the Wrath of Khan, since its entire plot is only an extension, even an inversion, from that of the previous film. Indeed, the plot of the search for Spock undoes much of what the Wrath of Khan had brought to the franchise. The search for Spock even begins with a recap of the previous film, as a two-part television episode would do, such a scenario having only occurred once in the original series, when Spock tried to hijack the Enterprise, and therefore risk his career to come to the aid of his friend Pike, the former captain of the Enterprise. So it's not the first time that friendship and loyalty have united Spock with the captain of the Enterprise on a level that exceeds that of their duty to Starfleet. And when Kirk is denied permission to return to Genesis to retrieve Spock's body, it quickly becomes apparent that he was only asking permission out of politeness.
The word, sir?
The word is no. I am therefore going anyway.
Admiral Morrow gives several reasons for his refusal. The Enterprise is an old ship, and Starfleet has decided not to repair the damage she suffered during her last voyage. Genesis has become a taboo and a place forbidden by the Federation, and Morrow does not believe in what he calls Vulcan mysticism.
You don't have to believe. I'm not even sure that I believe.
Kirk tries to make Morrow understand that it is out of loyalty and even friendship that he wants to undertake this quest. However, a brief look at the atmosphere on the other ships of Starfleet suggests that this loyalty and this friendship may be exclusive to the Enterprise, and that's what makes Kirk and his crew so endearing.
How much refit time till we can take her out again?
8 weeks, sir. But you don't have 8 weeks, so I'll do it for you in 2.
Mr. Scott, have you always multiplied your repair estimates by a factor of 4?
Certainly, sir. How else can I keep my reputation as a miracle worker?
Your reputation is secure, Scotty.
To contrast this friendship stronger than duty, the film introduces as antagonists a group of Klingons led by Krug, who places duty and honor above any bond of affection.
Jabbe pit. Kovedlig a to bej.
Was telech ho.
Ich lach Joey.
Doha.
Jayad. Kapla Joey. Angweje.
Takalu. Tak.
Since Star Trek is not an exact analogy of reality, and the writers prefer to use this universe to approach various subjects without too obvious similarities detracting from the message they are trying to convey or the questions they are trying to raise, the Klingons, when they appeared in some episodes of the original series, did not represent the Soviet Union as much as some claim. It would be more accurate to say that the authors were using the ongoing tension between the Federation and the Klingon Empire to comment on the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The real enemy, when the Klingons were appearing in an episode, was the war that threatened to break out at any moment, whether it was because of the Klingons or because of the Enterprise. Of course, it would have been a war against the Klingons, but above all, it would have been a war as a tragic and absurd concept.
Well, there it is. War. We didn't want it, but we've got it.
Curious how often you humans manage to obtain that which you do not want.
However, it was probably because the Cold War escalated during the 80s that the Klingons were chosen to be the antagonists in the search for Spock, when initially it was to be the Romulans. It's also because of this replacement, carried out late during the pre-production of the film, that the Birds of Prey, these Romulan vessels able to become invisible, are today rather associated with the Klingons, and also that I didn't know what a Romulan was for many years. These cousins of the Vulcans who did not embrace logic as their main philosophy only appeared in 2 episodes of the original series. The first time in Balance of Terror, where Mark Lenard, the actor who plays Sarek, played the Romulan captain, and for the record, he played the Klingon captain in the motion picture. One could even say that the process of replacing the Romulans with the Klingons had already been initiated in the Wrath of Khan, when the Kobayashi Maru test referred to a neutral zone separating Federation space from that of the Klingons, whereas the only neutral zone mentioned in the original series was the one separating Federation space from Romulan space. That being said, even though the film draws a parallel between the Federation and the Klingons by juxtaposing 2 scenes where both sides manifest the same intention, Krug and his crew do not represent the Empire, which brings them closer to Kirk's crew, who also doesn't represent the Federation in this film, as Kirk and his crew disobey Starfleet and steal the Enterprise to retrieve Spock's body from Genesis.
My friends, I can't ask you to go any further. Dr. McCoy and I have to do this. The rest of you do not.
Admiral, we're losing precious time.
What course, please, Admiral?
Mr. Scott?
I'd be grateful, Admiral, if you'd give the word.
Many say it was Christopher Lloyd's interpretation of Krug that paved the way for Worf and the Klingons in The Next Generation, and I believe them. I've been a big fan of Christopher Lloyd since I first saw him in The Pagemaster, a film which also stars Leonard Nimoy, Whoopi Goldberg, Patrick Stewart, Frank Welker, Moby Dick, and a soundtrack from James Horner. But back to Star Trek. I guess what keeps me from liking Krug as much as most fans is that I find him to be a sort of repetition of Khan, because he too wants to use Genesis as a weapon. It's a dramatic lag that makes the Klingons seem like they're just an arbitrary nuisance, almost a subplot of the film. It would have made more narrative sense to invent a reason for the Klingons to want to find Spock before Kirk, rather than once again giving them Genesis as a goal. However, faithful to the series which always presented Paradise as a trap, Genesis is a failure. Despite the reprimands David gave his father in the Wrath of Khan, the fruit didn't fall far from the tree, as David cheated in order to make Genesis work. For the third time since the first film, science misses its mark, but this time the message is clear. Don't play God who wants to. Indeed, after science was shown so prominently in the first film and used as a pretext for action scenes in the second, now it gives way to faith and religion in this third film. Because if Spock has always represented the individual on the margins of a group, it was also the case for the actor Leonard Nimoy. Unlike his colleagues, who virtually all ended up embracing Gene Roddenberry's views on religion, Nimoy continued to practice and to be active within his Orthodox Jewish community, reading and speaking Yiddish fluently.
Sein oder nicht sein? Or was ist die Frage?
Nimoy was also inspired by his religion to create several elements of Vulcan culture. By directing the search for Spock himself, he took this opportunity to inject what he had always thought Star Trek was lacking, a religiosity. As Kirk and his crew travel to Genesis to retrieve Spock's body, they learn that Spock has apparently come back to life. Although Spock can be seen as a Christ figure, the way he becomes one fits more with Nimoy's belief rather than the Christian resurrection. By placing his fingers on McCoy's face at the end of the Wrath of Khan, Spock entrusted his Katra to him so that it could be transferred into an ark on Vulcan.
How are we doing?
USS Enterprise.
How are we doing?
Respond, please.
It's funny you should put it quite that way, Jim. We are doing fine. But I'd feel safer giving him one of my kidneys than what's scrambled in my brain.
This is similar to Gilgul, a concept of reincarnation popular in Yiddish literature, according to which it would be possible for certain human souls to reincarnate in non-human bodies. However, it turns out that Spock's body, left on Genesis, has decomposed and that a new form of life has been built from its DNA, a clone that the planet is making age rapidly because of certain ingredients used by David in his recipe to create Genesis. So we end up on one side with a biological copy of Spock that has neither his memories nor his personality, and on the other side, the soul of Spock preserved in the mind of poor Dr. McCoy.
Could I offer you a ride home, Dr. McCoy?
Where's the logic in offering me a ride home, you idiot? If I wanted a ride home, would I be trying to charter a space flight?
In a way, one could say that The Search for Spock, the only film mentioning the name of one of the heroes in its title, is similar to Spock's Brain, the only episode of the original series mentioning the name of one of the heroes in its title.
His brain is gone.
His brain is missing. And Spock is dying.
No. An incredible Vulcan physique hung on to the life support cycle took over. His body lives, the autonomic functions continue. But there is no mind.
In this episode, more faithful to Gene Roddenberry's atheistic view, McCoy was not tasked with reintegrating Spock's Katra into his body, but with reintegrating his brain, a burden which Spock did not want to impose on McCoy at the time.
Captain, you might lose the doctor that way.
He might, but we're sure to lose you if I don't try.
I cannot allow you to jeopardize your life for me.
But McCoy proved to be able to endure this ordeal, which perhaps explains why Spock didn't hesitate before entrusting him with his Katra at the end of the Wrath of Khan. Just as the film doesn't explain very well why Sarek wants Spock's body, it doesn't explain very well the connection between Spock's seizures and the weather on Genesis.
His aging's part of what's going on around us.
Somewhere between the telepathic gifts of the Vulcans and the pseudoscience that went into creating Genesis, there is room for much debate between the fans. The same goes for other plot elements, like Scotty's modifications to the Enterprise so that she can now be piloted by just 5 people rather than a rotation of 500.
A chimpanzee and 2 trainees could run her.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I'll try not to take that personally.
Or Uhura's arrival on Vulcan when it's so hard for other heroes to get a ship. Unlike the Wrath of Khan, which was made up of 5 different scenarios, the search for Spock has a fairly simple and straightforward plot. In fact, it's as if all the storylines of the Wrath of Khan have been pulled together and put to use of only one. Of course, someone had to stay behind to allow the Enterprise to get away.
Yeah, well, maybe that's okay for someone like you, whose career is winding down. But me, I need some challenge in my life, some adventure.
Good evening, Commander. Is everything ready?
Step into my parlor, gentlemen.
But it's damn irregular. No destination orders, no encoded IDs.
You wanted Adventure House this. The old adrenaline going, huh? Good boy. Now get in the closet.
I'm glad you're on our side.
Can you handle that,
Oh, I'll have Mr. Adventure eating out of my hand, sir. And I'll see all of you at the rendezvous.
But Uhura's subsequent journey to Vulcan could have served as a subplot. The same goes for the Excelsior, the brand new ship of Starfleet.
Looking forward to breaking some of Enterprise's speed records tomorrow.
Yes, sir. Up your shaft.
But the Excelsior is expelled from the plot in a record time by Scotty without having been able to generate the slightest tension or even a small chase scene.
The more they overthink the plumbing, the easier it is to stop up the drain.
If there's one thing I've learned from Mission Impossible, or more honestly from Le Tour du Monde en 80 jours, it's that the stakes are always higher when the heroes are not only pursuing a goal, but are themselves pursued. Anyway, I don't want to list all of the film's flaws, but I pretty much agree with those who say The Search for Spock has all the ingredients needed to be a great movie, to provide a great sequel to The Wrath of Khan, and potentially a great conclusion for those who want to stop at the 3rd film, but it just misses the mark almost at every turn. And while the motion picture seems to have finally found its audience, that's not the case with The Search for Spock, which today serves as an argument for those who believe that the odd Star Trek movies are all bad. But The Search for Spock no more tries to measure its science fiction against that of the motion picture than its action sequences against those of the Wrath of Khan. What it offers instead is a human adventure. Contrary to what some believed when Leonard Nimoy volunteered to direct the film, The Search for Spock does not represent an actor's narcissistic attempt to put himself forward. Nimoy instead preferring to make the other characters shine like neither of the previous 2 films had done, and as rarely another franchise was ever going to do for characters of such an age.
Don't get smart, Tiny.
These days, such characters are usually cast as mentors or replaced by a younger cast, but Nimoy instead decided to embrace the narrative possibilities afforded by the Enterprise's aging crew, which seems to be going through a midlife crisis.
Don't call me Tiny.
The producers had offered Nicholas Meyer, the director of The Wrath of Khan, to direct the sequel, but Meyer didn't like the idea of Spock resurrecting, and I understand why. Resurrection in works of fiction is often gratuitous, clumsy, and diminishes the importance and significance of death. Worse, resurrecting Spock risked to completely undo the lesson Kirk learned in The Wrath of Khan, which thankfully it doesn't. There are several reasons why authors may want to kill one of their characters. It might be to obey a convention like the loss of the mentor, a formula that's been repeated so many times that you could predict Han Solo's death in Star Wars 7 just by watching the trailer, as well as his reappearance in Episode 9, like Ben Kenobi, Gandalf, Dumbledore, and several other mentors who ended up reappearing in one form or another after their death. I salute the Wachowski sisters who, in The Matrix, ensured that Neo lost his mentor without killing him, and instead made Morpheus the princess to be saved, a role that would conventionally have been assigned to Trinity. The death of a character can also be used to motivate the protagonist to act, as in revenge or superhero films. But since works of fiction are often written by men, for men, and focus on a heterosexual male hero, very often the authors choose to kill the hero's wife or girlfriend. Overused, the motivational death of a female character eventually became a convention denounced by Gail Simone through her Women in Refrigerators list, named after a passage in a Green Lantern comic. At other times, death takes the form of a punishment addressed to a character who has committed a fault, or can serve as a lesson to him when it's someone close to him who dies because of this, which is the case of Spock in The Wrath of Khan. Sometimes, death serves as redemption, an admittedly somewhat lazy redemption, since the character who dies is suddenly converted into a hero while providing no reparation for the wrongs he has caused. There are still other reasons for authors to have their characters die, but whatever the reason, there are times when they want to go back, because of course, in most cases, the death of a character is perceived as something dramatic. But we tend to forget that life is also dramatic, and that by killing a character, of course we generate a dramatically strong moment, but at the same time, we eliminate all the potential drama that the character could generate if we kept him alive.
It's a hell of a thing, killing a man. You take away all he's got, and all he's ever gonna have.
It's often when the writers find themselves in this situation, voluntarily or not, that they decide to resuscitate a character, which is sometimes celebrated by the public happy to see the return of a beloved character, and sometimes criticized when this resurrection is clumsy. Now that we have seen why a writer kills a character, let's see what, in my opinion, are the 4 main rules for a good resurrection. First, the resurrection of a character must not erase the consequences of his death. In the case, for example, of a conventional death such as that of the Mentor, where the fundamental objective is to make the apprentice stand on its own 2 feet, the resurrection of the Mentor should ideally not allow the apprentice to be able to count on his mentor again. On the other hand, as many have already pointed out, Palpatine's resurrection in Star Wars Episode 9 completely undoes Darth Vader's redemptive death in Episode 6. The second rule for properly resurrecting a character can be seen as an extension of the first rule. Indeed, if the death of a character has consequences on the story and on his loved ones, his resurrection must also have consequences. In other words, there must be a price to pay. In Casper, the resurrection of Kat's father comes at the cost of Casper's chance at coming back to life. In the third Pirates of the Caribbean, Will's resurrection comes at the expense of Jack's dream of becoming immortal, when his own resurrection had no effect on any plot-significant characters. If there's no price to pay, the resurrection must at least be delayed, as it was the case for Hal Jordan and Barry Allen in the comics, who were respectively resurrected 10 years and 25 years after their death, unlike Superman, who made his comeback barely a year after his death. One of the most disappointing resurrections in cinema remains that of Sherlock Holmes in A Game of Shadow, where, after adapting the iconic duel between Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty at the edge of the Reichenbach Falls, the film brings Sherlock back after only a few minutes. 12 years later, this franchise is still in a coma. On the other hand, in some works of fiction, the price to be paid for resurrection is so big that its prohibition becomes one of the fundamental rules of its universe. Which brings me to the last 2 rules for properly resurrecting a character. The resurrection of a character must be able to be explained either by an element introduced earlier in the plot or by the rules of the universe in question. For example, even if in Dragon Ball resurrection is a common practice and often without consequences, the fact remains that it's consistent with the Dragon Ball universe since it is achieved thanks to the so-called Dragon Balls, which are often at the core of the plot. In The Mummy Returns, Evelyn comes back to life thanks to the Book of the Dead, which has already resurrected several mummies before in the franchise. And of course, just as the second rule was an extension of the first, the fourth is an extension of the third, because resurrecting a character must not alter the rules of the universe in question, unless those alterations are explored later in the story. In other words, when a character is resurrected, the audience shouldn't wonder why the other characters who died weren't brought back to life. As one of the worst examples of this rule, we find Star Trek Into Darkness, at the end of which McCoy synthesizes a magic potion from the blood of Khan, which allows him to resuscitate Kirk, but also to put an end to death itself as long as he lets Khan's body renew its blood after each transfusion. However, this is never addressed in the sequel, Star Trek Beyond. Kirk's death and resurrection in Star Trek Into Darkness is once again a call for nostalgia from Alex Kurtzman, since they echo Spock's death and resurrection in the original films. Unlike Kirk's resurrection in Into Darkness, Spock's resurrection is the result of such a unique combination of circumstances that it will probably never be repeated in the future, and therefore does not alter the rules of the Star Trek universe. Moreover, it results from both information introduced in the previous film and new information that will now join the rules of the Star Trek universe. But what about the first 2 rules? How does Spock's resurrection not undo the consequences of his death in the previous film, and what new consequences does it bring? The search for Spock, as its title suggests, is not about resurrecting Spock. but about the quest to find him and what that quest teaches Kirk, that friendship is more important than space exploration.
Kirk, I thank you. What you have done is...
What I have done, I had to do.
But at what cost?
If I hadn't tried, the cost would have been my soul.
At the end of the film, Kirk has the opportunity to take the Kobayashi Maru test again, this time against real Klingons.
Commander Klingon vessel. Prepare to board this ship on my next signal.
No tricks, Kirk. You have 1 minute.
After devoting his life to her, Kirk now understands that the Enterprise is above all a crew united by friendship and does what he had never done except while he was bluffing. He causes the Enterprise's self-destruction to save his friends.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5.
Get out!
3,
Get out of there!
Taking example from Spock, who transferred his soul into another body, Kirk transfers the soul of the Enterprise, that is, her crew, out of the ship.
My God, Bones. What have I done?
What you had to do. What you always do. Turn death into a fighting chance to live.
But while he sacrificed his career and the Enterprise to save his friends, there is one sacrifice Kirk never expected to make, that of his son. Since the search for Spock is more religious than the previous 2 films, this time the deception of scientific progress is punished, and Dr. Frankenstein pays the price for his arrogance. For now, like several other elements of the film, this death falls a bit flat, since Kirk and David's relationship hasn't really been developed, but it will have consequences later in the franchise because something breaks inside Kirk.
Oh. Klingon bastard, you've killed my son.
Sure, he never carried the Klingons in his heart.
They're openly aggressive. They've boasted that they'll take over half the galaxy.
But from now on, the conflict is personal, and we see Kirk showing surprising cruelty during his confrontation against Krug.
I have had enough of you!
After which, this first thematic trilogy within the franchise ends where it began, on Vulcan. Last time we were there, Spock was a solitary monk failing the Kolinar ritual. Now, he has become a messiah surrounded by his friends.
Jim. Your name is Jim.
Yes.
And just as they brought his soul back to transfer it into this new body, the search for Spock finally brings back the soul of the Star Trek TV series, that is, humanity and friendship between the characters, to transfer it into this new cinematographic body. Once again, thank you for encouraging the channel by liking this episode and by activating the alerts. Tell me in the comments what you think of the search for Spock, and we'll meet again in a month to talk about the conclusion of the narrative trilogy initiated by the Wrath of Khan.